1 Peter chapter 1. We've been studying two words as they are used in the New Testament. Sozo, to save, that is to deliver or protect, to heal, to bring safely, or to preserve. And from the verb sozo comes the noun soteria, which means salvation, deliverance, health, preservation. Now, we've turned to Peter's first epistle today because Peter uses the word soteria 4 times in his first epistle and 1 time in his second epistle. And he uses the verb sozo 2 times in his first epistle. And there is important doctrinal significance in the way that Peter uses these words, and we are going to explore that in the coming sessions. But today we're going to do some preliminary background work so that we can understand historically and dispensationally the 2 letters and how they relate to the letters of Paul. Because we certainly don't want to rob from Paul to pay Peter. But we also do want to pay Peter what is due to him. That is due to him from the budget of accurately handling the word of truth in 2 Timothy 2, verse 15. So, when we come to the 2 epistles of Peter, when did Peter write these letters? Well, Charles Ryrie estimated the time of writing of Peter's 2 epistles to be during the years AD 63 through 66. And J. Vernon McGee estimated the time of writing of these 2 letters to be between AD 64 and 67. So that's a pretty similar window there. And most Bible teachers place Peter's epistles in the 60s. And the time of writing does have an important dispensational and historical significance. And when we come to trying to pin down the time of writing any epistle, do we just take a stab in the dark? Do people just take a stab in the dark when they date the epistles? Well, no. They shouldn't anyway. But you can usually get pretty close to dating an epistle by using the internal evidence of the epistle you are considering, along with any related evidence found within the book of Acts and within any other New Testament epistles. And establishing the time of the writing of an epistle does take some detective work. But if you're willing to do the work, you can usually narrow down the time of the writing of an epistle to a fairly specific window. And the first thing to consider about Peter's letters is that Peter wrote about suffering as a Christian in 1 Peter 4, verse 16. And since the disciples were first called Christians at Antioch, and that's in Acts 11, verse 26, and since Peter calls his readers Christians in 1 Peter 4, verse 16, when he writes about suffering as a Christian, well, we can be sure then that Peter wrote this first epistle sometime after the events of Acts chapter 11. So it was sometime after about AD 35. But as we're going to see, we can narrow down even further the time of writing of Peter's epistles as we consider more evidence to a narrower window than simply after AD 35. But let's start there, after AD 35 and before Peter died physically, whenever that was. But now we have in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1, and I'm reading from the New American Standard Version, 1995. 1 Peter 1, verse 1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen. And let's stop there in the reading and say this. These regions pretty much filled up the peninsula of Asia Minor. And you can see that on the map that I've handed out today. And these were all Gentile areas, far from Jerusalem and Judea, even far from Samaria. And in Acts 16, verse 7, in Luke's narrative about Paul, Bithynia had not even been evangelized yet when Paul considered going into Bithynia and was stopped from doing so by the Holy Spirit at that particular point in Luke's narrative. But Peter is writing to Christians who were established there. So we know that Peter wrote after the events in Acts chapter 16. So now we know that Peter wrote not only after AD 35, but after about AD 50. So you see how this works. We are establishing the approximate date of Peter's epistles from evidence in Peter's letters and the entire New Testament. Now, furthermore, Silvanus, and Silvanus is simply the Latinized version of Silas. So Silvanus, also known as Silas, was with Peter and carried this letter to those addressed. We find that in chapter 5, verse 12, and we're going to look at that today. But we know that Silvanus was Paul's traveling companion at least up to Acts 18, verse 5, which would place the letter later than Acts chapter 18, which would take it later than AD 52. Because on that missionary journey, Silas was traveling with Paul. Let's now consider this. Where was Peter when he wrote this epistle? Well, hold your place in 1 Peter 1 and turn over a few chapters to 1 Peter chapter 5, where Peter is going to close out this epistle. And in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Now, Mark is no other than John Mark. And is this speaking of John Mark being a literal physical son descended from Peter? No, this would be a spiritual son, as Titus was referred to by the Apostle Paul in Titus chapter 1, and Timothy was referred to by the Apostle Paul. Let's look at this again. In verse 13, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark. Well, the King James Version and some other versions have rendered this the church that is at Babylon. And that's because what is literally she in the Koine Greek is taken to be a metaphor for the church at the location from which Peter is writing, the believing community in that area, in Babylon, whatever Peter means by Babylon, and we'll explore that. But she who is in Babylon is most likely a reference to the church there. A similar metaphor is assumed in John's second letter, where John wrote, the elder to the chosen lady and her children. Most Bible teachers assume this to refer to the church. Now, was Peter actually in Babylon when he wrote this epistle? It is widely assumed he was not. But let's consider that. There are three views to this. The most popular view, at least in recent years, being that the place of the writing was actually Rome. and that Babylon was a symbolic name for Rome that Peter used to emphasize the similarities between the two empires, or that it was a code name used by writers, and here used by Peter, who wished to avoid drawing attention to his location as to be harassed by the Roman authorities. In other words, Peter didn't want everyone to know he was in Rome at the time. And this is all based on the assumption that Peter actually was in Rome just before and during Nero's persecution of Christians in the city of Rome in the 60s. And that's the view that I used to lean toward, that Peter was actually writing his first epistle from Rome. But in more recent times, with more recent study, I have changed my view. And he may well have been in Rome. Let me say this, I don't know. Of these three views, where was Peter when he wrote this epistle? I don't know. But in reconsidering this, I lean much more toward literal Babylon than I do Rome. And this is because the idea that Peter was actually in Rome is based on a lot of assumption. Do you know that the whole idea of Peter ever even going to Rome comes from church tradition, not the Bible? The so-called church fathers, early Christian writers, have written that Peter was martyred in Rome under the persecution of Nero. And that may well be true, but it does not mean that Peter had to be in Rome when he wrote his epistles. He could have gone there after he wrote his epistles. But the Bible doesn't even really say that Peter was in Rome ever. I am just very skeptical when I consider church tradition and history from the point of view of the early Christian writers, because there are a lot of things, I think, that have been written by some of these writers that are simply not true, and there has been a lot of superstition, especially about Peter, who came to be understood by many as the first pope of the church in the city of Rome. So, of these three views, there are those who take Babylon literally, the once great Babylon on the Euphrates. Now, ancient Babylon had long been destroyed. And at this period of history, it was not that great city that it had been. And yet there still was a significant colony of Jews that remained there after the captivity. And Josephus wrote about these Jews in this area. And additional Jews had fled to Babylon when the persecution of Jews began under the Emperor Claudius. Now, Babylon was a desolate and ruined city when Peter wrote his epistles, to be sure. Diodorus of Sicily, who wrote from 56 through 36 BC, stated that as for the palaces and other buildings, time has either entirely effaced them or left them in ruins, but a small part is inhabited at this time. In other words, at the time that Diodorus wrote. And he wrote, and most of the area within its walls is given over to agriculture. So the city was not totally destroyed, and it was used for agricultural purposes within its walls. And likewise, the historian Strabo, 19 BC, wrote that the greater part of Babylon is so deserted that one would not hesitate to say the great city is a great desert. So based on the condition of the ancient city of Babylon at that time, people assume, or they have assumed anyway, along the years, that it would be unlikely that Peter wrote from literal Babylon. And they also base it on the fact that Babylon was a long distance from those to whom Peter was writing. However, look at the map that I've handed out to you today, and you'll see that Rome was not a short distance from the regions that Peter wrote to. Rome was not a short distance at all. Now, what would Peter have been doing in this outlying region if Peter indeed wrote from the great ancient city of Babylon? Why would Peter have been so far from home in such a remote place? Well, maybe because he was being a witness for the Lord Jesus Christ, even to the remotest part of the earth, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. Why would God have Peter in such a remote and desolate place? I got to thinking about this. Why would God have Paul in Arabia for 3 years after his conversion before going to Jerusalem and then proceeding with his ministry? Well, I believe to isolate him, to give him solitude, actually to keep him away from the other apostles for a season, in a place where he would not be hearing from the other apostles but from God, and to thus prepare Paul for his ministry. Or why would God have Paul write the epistles that set forth the great mystery, the epistles we refer to as the prison epistles? Why would God have Paul write those epistles from rented quarters under 2 years of house arrest, confined to those quarters? Well, I believe so Paul could pause and reflect and pray and write in solitude. And in great rapport with God in that solitude. So why would God have Peter write his epistle from an ancient city in ruins that was not populated by so many people, that only part of the city was even populated by people? Well, Peter wrote his epistles to Jewish believers, as we're going to take notice of. They were Jewish believers. They were members of Christ's body, but believers who were of Jewish background. That's to whom Peter was writing. Believers who, like himself, had been immersed in Jewish tradition and legalism. And these believers needed special attention. Peter needed time with God to prepare him to set forth the doctrine that was so needed by these believers. Peter needed to be away from James and the elders in Jerusalem and what was going on in Jerusalem. And he needed to be away from the other apostles as well. Maybe as far away as possible. So it does not seem strange to me at all that God may have had Peter in a desolate and ruined city in a distant place. The ruins, yet still somewhat populated, of ancient Babylon. Now, there is a third possibility as to where Peter was writing from, and that would be literal as well, literal Babylon. But there was a settlement in Egypt on the east bank of the Nile called Babylon. So Babylon in Egypt, not well known like the other Babylon, but nevertheless called Babylon, a settlement that later became a fortress long after Peter wrote, but this settlement became a fortress under the Emperor Diocletian. But there are those who have assumed, I don't think it's a popular view any longer, but that that's the Babylon from which Peter was writing, a settlement in Egypt. And lending support to that view is the fact that John Mark, who was with Peter when he wrote his first epistle, is traditionally believed to have traveled to Egypt around AD 49, becoming the first bishop of the Church of Alexandria. So again, that gets into the tradition of men, not what the Bible actually says. But I believe that view is a possibility. So it could have been, Peter could have been writing from the city of Rome. He could have been writing from the ancient city of Babylon. And he could have been writing from Babylon, a settlement in Egypt. But after break, we're going to pay close attention just to whom Peter was writing. Because from where Peter was writing is not so important, but to whom Peter was writing is of great historical and dispensational significance.